Hello, this is the chapter reading for Entwined by A L Morrow. Chapter 1, Aisling. It was difficult to spot the feather in the shadows beyond the barrier. It could have been an errant leaf, discolored and withered, falling from the twisted branch of a nearby tree. It could have been a snowflake, tumbling from the heavy clouds above, stranded in a perpetual state of winter. Or it could have been a fleck of ash from the cold fires that sometimes swept through the forest, singeing the life that was already dormant. But Aisling did notice the feather. As she reached over to trim an especially lovely branch from the tree in front of her, she saw it on the periphery. Small and gray, reminiscent of the tuft from a dandelion, it fluttered a moment overhead, drawing closer. What it was a feather from she could not imagine. It could have been a sparrow, as much as a harpy, a pigeon, as much as a three-headed, poison-breathing, shape-shifting monster of the skies. Aisling didn't know. There seemed no end to the number of creatures that dwelled in the winter woods, feeding on dreams, devouring nightmares. She could spend a lifetime in Alstrath and never see each type of beast. Not quite yet, she murmured to herself as she watched the feather approach, but the transparent arc of the barrier. Guessing the exact moment an exterior object would strike against the magical shield, dissolving on contact, was a childhood game, one she had played with Orla and Anya when they were smaller and her father was still alive. Old patterns were certainly easier to uphold than to break, she supposed. Right now. Out of habit, Aisling guessed at the moment of impact aloud. But the feather didn't disintegrate, shattering into infinite pieces invisible to her eye, and it didn't cause the arc to waver, the nightmare world beyond its border blurring momentarily as it protected the life that dwelled below, in the real world. It simply kept falling, bypassing the enchantments that protected her home and the surrounding settlement, flitting gently to the ground by her feet, like any other. Oh, Aisling gasped, and the shears in her hand snapped the twig in front of her, as if on their own will. That shouldn't have happened. This shouldn't be happening. The thoughts repeated in her mind as she stared at the strange foreign feather. She stepped back quickly, as if the thing might be diseased, and she was right to. After a moment of staring up at her innocently, the feather turned black from the edges in. Mold-like warts and blotches bubbled up from its dark surface, and it seemed to sink into the ground as though surrounded by quicksand. Aisling's heart thumped against her chest, tripping over its own beat like the military drums played during guard changes at the castle in Newkirk. She glanced up, searching the barrier dome for signs of a flaw or failure. There must be a hole, a dent, something, anything to explain the anomaly. But the barrier had returned to its usual state. A glassy shell, window-like, stable and solid, protection against the nightmares dwelling in the dark forest beyond. Aisling, where are my leaves? Move with purpose. With purpose. Orla's noxious screech drew Aisling's attention back to the task at hand. Startling, she spotted her stepsister leaning out the kitchen window, dressed in a silk robe, waving her two thin arms frantically. Stop daydreaming, she seethed. The carriage is coming soon. We need you inside. Aisling swallowed. She looked down at the branch in her hands, hastily snipped in her panic over the fallen feather. Orla had demanded a slender branch with fresh leaves in the same golds and reds as her gown. She wanted it for her hair, to weave into the elaborate arrangement of auburn curls she had spun atop her head. By luck and the anxious jerk of her hand, Aisling had provided. This branch would do well enough, with its canary and citrine-toned leaves. There was no red, which meant Orla would inevitably protest. But Aisling would explain there was enough red in her stepsister's hair and gown as it was. She would convince her. She had to. With falling dark dream stuff somehow passing through the barrier, she had no wish to remain outdoors any longer. Giving the decrepit fallen feather one last look, Aisling turned back toward the cottage. That isn't how I wanted it, Aisling, Orla scolded as she held up a hand mirror and examined her reflection. You were supposed to weave the branch and leaves into my hair, not just stick them on top like an antenna. I look like an insect, for God's sakes." Aisling recoiled at her stepsister's scolding. Orla might have been 1 year her junior, but she was demanding and opinionated, the clear leader of the house, aside from Bronag, Aisling's stepmother, and Orla's and Anya's mother. Aisling should not have been surprised by the rebuke. It wasn't the first time her stepsister had complained about her work. It wasn't the first time her sister. Just last week, Orla had protested at Aisling's first attempt to create a fast to pin to the top of her head. "I won't wear that," she'd said, picking at the decoration as though it were a dead fish that had risen to the surface of their pond. "You haven't got the shading on the leaves right to match my dress. I want real ones." Aisling had looked down at the little pretty hat she'd woven out of brown ribbon and wire to resemble branches. It had taken her hours to get the angles of the artificial twigs just right, just to be deemed useless. Trash. The incident had led to Aisling's venture to the garden earlier, to her snipping branches and spotting dream stuff break through the barrier. Now her latest attempt was apparently also inferior. Emerging from the adjoining living room, Anya agreed. Laughing, their youngest sibling brought her arms to wrap around the swell of her belly. "You do look like an insect." Orla scowled. She glared at Anya, then Aisling, apparently unsure who deserved her wrath. "I told you," she hissed at the latter. As Aisling opened her mouth to apologize, she reached toward the branch to reposition it, but Orla slapped her away as soon as she got close enough. The smack of her pale, bony hand against Aisling's was whip-like and startling. "I'll do it," she insisted coolly, immediately burying her hands in the elaborate tangle of braids and curls spun in a hive-like mound atop her head. "I'm happy to try again." Orla simply rolled her eyes. "Third time is not the charm. Just hold the mirror for me." Lowering herself to the seat opposite her stepsister at the kitchen table, Aisling did as she was told. She always did as she was told. Ever since her father died, it was what Bronag had made clear she. The obedience her stepmother demanded was a perpetual reminder that the late Shane Glasby had left this cottage and everything surrounding it, the garden and the small pond in the back, to his wife, not his only blood daughter. It was also a punishment for Aisling's role in his death. She was not a guest in this house that had been her childhood home. She was a servant. One by one, Orla tore the leaves and ribbons from her hair, mussing the carefully woven twists and plaits Aisling had labored over earlier. The discarded decorations joined the rhinestones, lipsticks, and rouges scattered across the kitchen table. "Are you sure everyone else will be wearing their hair this way at the ball?" Aisling asked. "What if you arrive and no one else is dressed so elaborately? This isn't a costume party, is it?" Orla froze, but not because she feared that Aisling might be right, that she was overdressed. She froze because the opposite was true. Her eyes narrowed, darting over to Anya, who was adding yet more glitter to the starbursts and comets Aisling had painted on her cheeks. Immediately the pair burst out in bitter laughter, mocking their older stepsister's inexperience. "By the gods, Aisling, you are so uncivilized," Orla scoffed. "Add this to the list of reasons why we can't let you show up at the castle tonight. You know nothing of how decadent these royal events are." Anya snorted. Can you imagine Aisling trying to fit in? Her stare lingered pointedly over the plain brunette braid resting on Aisling's shoulder, on her makeupless face that was still smeared with adhesive from applying their false lashes, and on her simple work dress with its rounded neckline and straight sleeves. "Or dancing with Prince Callum or his husband?" Orla added with a scathing glee. Aisling felt her face burn. Her grip on the hand mirror went slack, and when Bronag herself promptly stormed into the room, she nearly dropped it altogether. The older woman had dressed as a raven for the occasion, black silks and feathers. She had Orla's too thin frame and bird-like facial features, accompanied by Anya's dark hair and heavy-lidded eyes. Perhaps she had been beautiful once. Now she appeared perpetually smug and hungry. It was a grim look that her choice in attire did little to dispel. "Ladies, that's enough," Bronag ordered tersely. There was nothing in her stepmother's voice to suggest that her impatience for Orla and Anya's cruel mockery had anything to do with sympathy for Aisling, but a wave of relief washed over the young woman anyway. However, her stepsister's teasing had come to an end. It was over. "The carriage is arriving. I saw it rounding the bend in the road from my window upstairs," Bronag informed them as she pulled on her gloves. "We must be off if we are to reach Newkirk by dark." "Oh!" Panic took hold in Orla's features as she struggled to fix her hair. "I'll never get this right in time. Never." "There's always the fascinator," Aisling suggested softly. "It will cover what you must." Orla's face crinkled in a mixture of despair and horror, but she pulled the last remnants of the offending tree branch from her hair anyway. "Fine. Get it," she seethed through clenched teeth. Aisling rose from the table, eager to locate the decoration among the discards. A small sense of victory bubbled in her chest, though she tried to conceal her smile. Secretly, she thought she would not miss her stepfamily tonight. Chapter 2. Teague. "It's not too late to call it off, you know." Despite the generous offer, Teague didn't turn around. He didn't move, partly because the endless carousel of carriages pulling up to the front of the castle was too great a spectacle to ignore. And he didn't move because he couldn't bear for Callum to see the frown on his face, evidence of his grim awareness that after tonight, nothing would be the same between them. Proof of his fear of being excluded when they finally found her. The one. The woman who would bear Callum's child and the successor to the throne of Glenplath. "Simply say the word, Teague," Callum continued, "and I'll send them all home again." The prince had moved closer this time until he was standing right behind him. Teague could feel the warmth of the taller man's breath on the back of his neck. He could smell his cologne, bergamot and spice with smoky undertones, equal parts warm and fresh, an intoxicating manly scent that suited Callum well. Then Teague felt him. Callum's hand grazed the bare small of his back. He wrapped his arms around him, tucking him into the shallow cavern of his chest, the one that ran right between his pecs before giving way to the masterfully sculpted abs below, the one that Teague was fond of running his fingertips slowly up and down during those quiet post-coital moments before they drifted off to sleep at night. And then the prince kissed him, a nibble on his earlobe, a series of pecks trailing down the side of his neck, then a swirl of tongue and lips on his shoulder, gently sucking the soft skin he found there. Immediately, Teague's hesitation melted. It was one thing to be sweet-talked by the prince. It was another to be fondled by him. And the merging of the two was virtually impossible to resist. Teague was being foolish, jealous. Of course Callum loved him. He married him, not whatever woman he would invite into their bed. And Teague would love the baby they produced. The child would be half Callum's after all. Perhaps it would be a little boy with Callum's mussed blonde hair and athletic inclinations. Or a girl, one with the prince's charismatic smile and blue eyes. With one glance, she'd disarm the inevitably long line of suitors she would have someday. They would raise the child together, he and Callum. They would finally have a family. That was what he wanted, and what they both wanted. Suddenly the parade of young women arriving in their jewels and lace, curls, and gowns seemed far away again. There was only this moment, and the two of them within it. "Don't be ridiculous. You know I could never ask you to give up your crown for me," Teague whispered. He closed his eyes, reveling in the prince's ministrations, his cock growing increasingly hard. "That doesn't matter. If it was the price required to bring you happiness, I would," Callum said, slipping his hand into Teague's trousers. He grasped the tip of his partner's manhood and rolled the swell between his thumb and index finger. "You know this, don't you?" Teague drew a ragged breath and leaned back into the prince's embrace. What began as a squeeze turned into a long stroke, a careful course down Teague's shaft, hot and velveteen. Then the prince delved further, seeking the sack between his lover's legs and massaging the pair of jewels there with the enthusiasm of a gem thief beholding his latest treasure. "Yes," Teague murmured, though neither of the men was certain if the syllable was an acknowledgment of the prince's words or an affirmation of his pleasure. Thank you.